Hello and welcome along. So, we're going to talk about the second founding today. The second founding has to go down as one of the pivotal moments in the history of the 40k universe because it really changes the structure of the Astartes organization from the pre-heresy structure of legions to the post-heresy structure of chapters, which is what we're left with in the current universe. Okay, so let's start with why did it happen? Well, essentially because Guilliman wanted it to. So at the end of the Heresy, there was a major power vacuum in the Imperium, with the Emperor essentially dead, although not truly dead, and Malcador dead, and many of the Primarchs, obviously now traitors, or dead, and dead. And of course, huge devastation across the Imperium, absolute chaos, excuse the pun, running riot across the Imperium, renegade worlds, chaos, corrupted worlds. Even Terra itself, of course, is devastated by the Siege of Terra, and the leadership of the Imperium is up for grabs. And of course, Guilliman steps into the breach. And so, because perhaps the more obvious candidates of Malcador or Sanguinius are both dead, Guilliman is given the position of Lord Commander, and so has, in theory, the ultimate authority over the military, at least, of the Imperium. He does still have several of his loyalist brothers surviving, and so it's not as simple as that. So he has to convince them that this is the right thing to do. He has developed the Codex Astartes, of course, which is more about tactics than it is about the size of the legions. But during the development of these tactics, his ideas move towards a more flexible, smaller force of around 1,000 warriors that is self-contained and can operate independently. Now, this isn't really a video about the Codex Astartes and those tactics, but the point is that does inform his idea of, therefore, breaking up the legions. Now, of course, the legions could have operated like that anyway. They had structures, grand companies or chapters, other medium-sized groups within the larger legions, so they could have operated like that and still remained as legions. But his other point was, and this is really the key point, is he feared that the heresy would happen again, and that the only way to stop that was to take away that power that was concentrated in one man's hands. So if you command a legion, you might have a full-size legion, you might have 100, 200,000 Astartes at your command. That is an enormous amount of power, not to mention all of the fleet element and the other support units that go along with the legion. And so he decides that the power structure has to change, and that the most any one person could be trusted with would be 1,000 Astartes. And that's really what the second founding is about. It's about reducing the chances of the heresy happening again, in Guilliman's eyes. Now, of course, this leads to huge controversy, because all he's essentially saying is, I don't trust you, my brothers, to keep this power. It's happened before, and it could happen again, and therefore that means it could happen again by one of you going traitor. He's essentially pointing the finger at them and saying, I can't 100% trust that you will never go traitor in the future. And that really pisses them off, particularly Dawn, who personally feels responsible for the heresy happening for some reason. I'm not entirely sure why he feels so guilty. I mean, he did make mistakes, but he probably got a lot less than many others. So Dawn, Russ, and Vulcan are all very strongly opposed to the idea. And that's half of the living Primarchs, or at least loyalist Primarchs. While Jaghatai Khan and Korax are not strongly opposed to it, they reluctantly accept it, that it has to be that way. They're not enthusiastic for it, but they're like, well, yeah, I can see your point, basically. And they go along with it. So that kind of puts it as a 3 versus 3, but Guilliman's got the official power, so it kind of swings it in his favor, really. So the decision goes ahead, and the second founding occurs. So although Russ will never accept the reorganization of the Legion as along the Codex lines, he does allow the creation of a second founding chapter from the Space Wolves, or the Wolf Brothers, the ill-fated Wolf Brothers, who will go crazy and turn traitor. But he doesn't know that this time, does he? And Vulcan doesn't really have a decision to make when it comes to a second founding chapter of the Salamanders, because there are just so few of them left that they can't actually make a second founding chapter at this time. And also, although Dawn strongly opposes the Codex Astartes, in particular, his problem is with the dividing of the Legion. He does allow it to happen eventually. essentially to avoid another civil war, because it does get to the point where violence is starting to occur because of this division amongst them. And the Primarchs can see a kind of the seeds of another internal conflict escalating, and so they reluctantly agree to allow this second founding to happen. And so, despite all of the reluctance and the opposition from the other Primarchs, it does go ahead. Now, like all history of the Imperium, the history of the second founding is extremely patchy. So, what does seem to be known is that there were something like, let's say, 50-ish chapters created at the second founding by dividing up the survivors of the loyalist legions, and roughly half of those were ultramarines, because there were more ultramarines surviving than any other legion, and potentially, and I think relatively likely, some loyalists from traitor legions were also incorporated into these chapters, either by combining people from the loyalist legions with loyalists from traitor legions, or even simply starting chapters out of loyalist Astartes from traitor legions. So a good candidate for that is the Carcharodons, the space sharks, who are potentially Night Lords combined with Raven Guard. Officially, their gene stock is Raven Guard, but I think there's a very clear indication that there has some combination of Night Lords in that chapter's creation. My personal belief and hope is that Sevatar, the former first captain of the Night Lords, is involved in creating the chapter. It's a bit difficult to work out exactly how that could happen, but the final scenes of Sevatar's life, as recorded in the 40k history via the books of the Horus Heresy, do strongly imply that he is going off into the void to do something very similar to what the Carcharodons actually do. So I think it's reasonably plausible that he is their founding father, if you like. It was made legitimate by the Imperium by giving him some quantity of like-minded Raven Guard to form the chapter. I mean, there's lots to dig into with individual chapters like the Carcharodons and others suspected of being linked to traitor legions. There are other chapters where you can look at them and think they're supposed to be officially Ultramarine successors, and they're very clearly not. And others that simply have no official record of who they're supposed to be a successor to, and have hints of being from traitor gene seed. Now, of course, because this is the second founding, this isn't really just about creating a new legion from just gene seed. You have to have actual physical Astartes, there, men to form the chapter, who would then build that chapter up with gene seed that is available to them. But there isn't founding them from nothing. They aren't just being founded from recruits. Some of the later foundings do seem to just be creating chapters out of nothing, essentially. Just going, okay, we're going to use this gene seed from, say, the Ultramarines, and we're going to create a new chapter. But of course, that would take time, because you need to build up those numbers, train them, recruit candidate, get them through the implantation process, get them through the training, etc., form them into a large enough force where you can call them a chapter, because you probably wouldn't need to be a whole 1,000, but several hundred, and then that's kind of your proto chapter, and then give them a command structure, etc. This is going to take time. Whereas if you've already got pre-existing Astartes who can fulfill the senior roles, you can give them a decent number of recruits. They can train them and organize them and lead them, and then they just keep adding, over time, more and more recruits until they build up to around 1,000. With the second founding, these are all pre-existing Astartes being divided up into new formations. So if a chapter is formed from traitor gene seed, it means also there are actual previous members of a traitor legion, like, for example, the Carcharodons, where Sevatar and his closest followers from the Night Lords could be that initial command structure in the Carcharodons. So for other legions founded at the second founding, who potentially are from traitor gene seed, then it would mean also that there were legionaries who were from a traitor legion. And of course, we do know that there were quite a few legionaries from the traitor legions fighting for the Emperor still during the Heresy. Famously, many of them became followers or agents of Malcador, And there were quite a few that were kind of held captive for some time on Terra or in the solar system, in various places, kind of in prisons essentially, because they just weren't. The Imperium was so afraid of this treachery, they found it very difficult to trust anybody, regardless of where they said their loyalties lie. There were, for example, a reasonable number of Death Guard who were kept in prison on Luna, the moon, during the Heresy, and some were allowed out from time to time to join to do special missions and so on. But at the end of the Heresy, were they still there? Possibly. And what could they be formed into a nucleus for a new chapter? I mean, I think you want to use them. The Imperium is on its knees. It's desperate for any kind of military force to go out and pursue the traitors as they escape into the Eye of Terror, and to retake all of these planets that have fallen into rebellion. And so I do think that there could be lots of examples of this where there were loyalists from within traitor legions that could have been used as the core for a new chapter at this stage of the second founding. Now, of the more conventionally recruited second founding chapters, some stand out. Some have risen to quite considerable fame. Amongst those, probably the Black Templars stand out, famous for their lack of adherence to the Codex Astartes and their increase in size, their permanent crusade across the galaxy. And in many ways, they reflect that initial reluctance, very strong reluctance of the Imperial fists to adopt the Codex Astartes and to accept the division of the Legion. And in many ways, they're just one big finger to Guilliman. Another second founding chapter that have risen to considerable fame would be the Flesh Tearers, successors to the Blood Angels, mainly because of their incredible ferocity. The Flesh Tearers are an interesting one because they almost turned to chaos. They were the part of the Blood Angels that were this close to turning to chaos. During the Heresy, when Horus was trying to get rid of the Blood Angels, he put them into a situation where they were trapped on a demon-infested world and had to fight for their survival, during which a company led by Nasir Amit, known as the Flesh Tearer, for his incredible ferocity, they almost became Khorne Berserkers. They killed a Space Wolves watch pack who were there with them on the planet to watch Sanguinius, and because they had temporarily given in to the Red Thirst and were on the path to becoming Khorne Berserkers, they managed to step back from the edge, but they're always very close to it. They represent the most savage, most bloodthirsty of the Blood Angels Legion put into one chapter. I mean, you think that'd be a recipe for disaster, but it doesn't seem to have gone well. Okay, apart from some minor incidents, it hasn't led to them turning to chaos and becoming traitors. So, although Guilliman's original vision for the creation of these chapters was that they would all follow the Codex Astartes and all be very similar, in reality, there's huge variety amongst the second founding chapters, and each of those second founding chapters that have gone on to produce additional chapters from their own gene seed have led to even more diversity. So you have this spreading out of practices that are of divergent practices, moving away from that initial idea of Guilliman of the Codex, and the chapters becoming increasingly more and more divided as they expanded out. Because if we can estimate there was an initial 50-ish chapters created at the second founding, that's expanded out to like 1,000 chapters-ish. So like 20 times as many chapters. And many of them are very different from the chapters that they were founded from, and even more different from the legions that their gene stock was originally taken from. And of course, really, Guilliman's vision for a very structured and for a strict adherence to the Codex was never really going to work, particularly after his death, or almost death. And there was already so much resistance to it in the first place. And once you create a small unit, that means you have more units. More units is inevitably going to lead to more division, even to the point where Ultramarines' successor chapters have diverged so much they don't follow the Codex. And so in implementing the division of the legions into chapters, it actually increased the diversion from the Codex, not help maintain it. Like perhaps had he kept the legion structure, it could have. Of course, the big problem with keeping the legion structure is it would have been very imbalanced, because you would have had this quite large chunk of Astartes being Ultramarines under one commander, and then these other smaller forces from the other legions who weren't much more than 1,000 anyway because of casualties during the Heresy. So it would have been quite a weird, imbalanced structure. So he was probably right in what he did in terms of making a more balanced organization of the available legionaries. So simply for practical reasons, there needed to be some reorganization of the command structure. Otherwise, it would have been too imbalanced. And of course, there are benefits to this diversion from the Codex as well. So even though it was unintended by Guilliman, because there were so many of these chapters, they were able to adapt to local conditions, develop new techniques, new traditions, taking from the influence of their new homeworlds, their new recruits, that would move them away from the chapter and move them in a direction away from the traditions and tactics, etc., of their predecessors, but also make them more suitable for the locations and the roles that they had taken on, and in some ways improve the Imperium's ability to adapt to new enemies and new conditions that may come in the future. Now, in terms of its other main objective, to reduce the power under one person and therefore avoid a repeat of the Heresy, did it succeed? Well, kind of. I mean, there hasn't been a second Heresy at the scale of the Horus Heresy, but very many rebellions occurred since that time, many of them, and some of them really big ones. Also, it meant that the coordination of the Imperial forces was harder because they are more divided. There's more individual commanders who feel that they have the ultimate authority over their Astartes. You've got 1,000 commanders instead of 18 who feel that they have ultimate authority of what their troops should do. This wasn't such a problem in the very early stages after the second founding, when there were Primarchs still around, because the military power was focused on those surviving 6 Primarchs. But as they slowly died or disappeared, that left a very divided military, because yes, there was less power in one person's hands if they did turn traitor, but there were many more people who, if they did turn traitor, had a significant military force to use. So really the second founding was very much a double-edged sword, and it made some improvements. It also increased vulnerabilities to the Imperium in other ways as well. So you can't really say whether it was a good idea or not, or whether it worked or not, because Guilliman, when he came up with the idea, didn't expect to be in stasis for 10,000 years after being mortally wounded. He didn't expect his brothers to disappear. So he probably, had it panned out how he had imagined it, then it probably was a good idea. As that didn't happen, it probably made the Imperium weaker, more prone to constant rebellion, as individual chapter leaders took their turn at thinking that they were more important than the Imperium, or that the Imperium was treating them too poorly. And an endless string of renegade chapters then occurred across the 10,000 years of which Guilliman was absent. And of course, had the second founding not happened, then all of the subsequent foundings wouldn't have happened. Instead, you would just be left with the nine loyalist legions slowly rebuilding themselves and trying to increase in size. And once each of the remaining 6 Primarchs had either died or disappeared, they would have to have appointed new Legion Masters to take over. And so you would have 9 Legion Masters as the focus of the main Imperial military power and decision-making. And if one of those went traitor, for example, if the new Legion Master of the Ultramarines was somehow turned traitor, then that would effectively be half of or more of the Astartes available to the Imperium fighting the other half, and that would be a repeat of the Horus Heresy. So perhaps, although not knowing that this would happen, Guilliman was right, because having that level of power in the hands of one person would have been a major threat to the Imperium that no one probably could have stopped. But by that logic, you would have ended up with a Ultramarines of, say, 500,000 strong, and then 500,000 other Astartes. So that would have been a very weird military structure, and difficult to see how that would function in a practical way. Perhaps a better compromise position would have been had the 8 legions remained intact and the Ultramarines be divided, say, into 8 smaller divisions, which would become their own legions, and then you would have 16 legions that would be roughly equal size and then could increase into the future. Anyway, there you go. So what do you think of the second founding? Do you have a particular second founding favourite chapter? Do you think it should have gone ahead? Do you think it would have actually been better had the legions remained? If you were in the position of one of the Primarchs who'd survived the Heresy, would you have resisted Guilliman's plans, or would you have gone along with them? Would you have risked another civil war over that decision? And if you were Guilliman and you're wedded to this idea, how far would you take it to enforce it on your brother Primarch? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you next time.